Hello, guys and girls. The program you are about to hear will be both fun and educational, but it is not a substitute for medical advice. Although we are doctors, we are not your doctors. Hello, and welcome to Travel Medicine. As always, I'm your friendly neighborhood internal medicine doc, Dr. J.
Heyo! This is your amazing pediatric infectious disease doc and researcher, Dr. Santhosh.
And Santhosh, I have been, well, snowed in, but enjoying
Oh no.
watching some old movies this last weekend, going back to the classics.
Yes, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles.
Also good classics, although I have to tell you, being older,
Yeah,
I empathize more with everyone who's out to
the
get
principal.
Ferris. Yeah,
and
just
the
just a
principal
truly
in the Breakfast Club. It's
just a
like,
truly awful human being. But no,
yeah,
today
yeah.
I wanted to do a dive into one of my favorite movies and explore some medicine in it that I don't think we've really thought about. And I'm, of course, referring to a film that was going to be an alternative career for me had I not settled on medicine, and that is
Adventurer.
Archaeologist slash Tomb Raider. I don't know. But
Yeah.
we're going to the
Yeah.
classic with
Okay.
Indiana Jones. So this week, we're going to be talking a little bit about Indiana Jones medicine or some specific scenes from the films. Now, I've told you in the past, Santosh, my theory about Indiana Jones being, as much as I love him, one of the most unnecessary protagonists in all of film history.
We have talked about this. I unfortunately the revelation, the pop culture reference that showed this to me was The Big Bang Theory, where a couple of characters were watching, I believe it was Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one turns to the other and goes, "Oh, that was interesting." They were actually watching it for the first time, and the other person was all excited for them to be, "Oh my god, Indy!" And the other person, "Well, that was all right, I guess, but Indiana was completely unnecessary." And the person was, "Wait, no, they're the hero." And they said, "No, if Indiana hadn't existed throughout the whole film." The Nazis would have gotten the Ark, they would have opened it up, and they would have all melted anyway. He's- the only thing he did was like break a bunch of stuff along the way. I was like, oh no,
And
it's true.
this is all of the Indiana Jones movies. Temple of Doom, everyone in that village still poor. Like, okay, he broke up a little bit
Yeah,
of a mining ring, but realistically
sure.
speaking, you tell me how long it's going to be before someone else shows up and restarts that mine. But Temple of Doom is the one
Sure.
where he had the most of a direct impact. Let's go to
Yeah.
Last Crusade. Nothing could leave the cave
Okay.
anyway. They could have just sent in parades of people to drink from that mug
Sure.
and
Sure.
wouldn't have changed. Crystal
Yeah.
Skull,
Okay.
again,
Oh, the
ending
crappy one. Okay.
the the ending of that film would not have changed if Indy hadn't existed. You know, even if the Russians won,
Sure.
got the skull, wouldn't. And even Dial of Destiny, which I won't spoil, definitely worth watching. But if Indy hadn't
Okay.
existed or had prematurely died before the events of the movie took place, it would have ended exactly the same.
And you've told me this before. Still endlessly entertaining films, barring the Crystal Skulls. But, absolutely, you cannot find a single moment in any of those movies where you couldn't just take the protagonist out and the arc, pun intended, of the plot was exactly the same.
Now, the behind the scenes actually had a lot of fun medicine things. Of course, in Raiders, there's that famous scene where Indy squares off with a masterful swordsman, and the
Yeah,
guy
a
does a
big
whole
guy too.
bunch. The guy does a whole bunch of fancy tricks, and then Indy looks at him, pulls out his gun, and he just shoots him.
Bang! Yes. Yeah. How's that medical? I mean, it was funny. I heard that scene was improvised, like last second, with Harrison Ford and Steven Spielberg, and he was like, I guess he was supposed to have a choreographed fight, but then he goes to Steven and he says, "Hey, wouldn't it be hilarious if I just shot him because I have a gun?" And Steven was like, "Oh yeah, absolutely." And they just scrapped a bunch of plot or screenplay. Is like, how's that medical?
Because Harrison Ford had dysentery, didn't think he could last the entire length of the shoot, and said, "How about I just shoot him? I don't want to do the whole choreograph thing. I'm going to need to make it to a
Uh,
bathroom."
oh, okay. So it's so it wasn't one of these improv like, oh, haha, this will be funny. This was just, yeah. Oh, poor guy, dysentery. Oh,
Well, they were
oh,
filming on location in Tunisia. A ton of the crew got sick. Now, Steven
oh,
Spielberg
oh,
Steven
yeah.
Spielberg, however, didn't, because every time he got in the shower, he would put gaffer tape over his mouth so no water
Oh,
would get in, and he traveled
oh,
with a
smart.
suitcase full of SpaghettiOs.
Yeah. I don't know how that is also medical, but I feel like it is. Like, I feel like like we could somehow also make that medical with eating SpaghettiOs. I don't know how many days, and but he didn't get sick because of that. The SpaghettiOs saved his life.
Because he wasn't eating the local food or getting any water in his mouth even when he was showering, and so he was not
Yeah.
exposed to
Yes.
local bugs.
So the headline here, though, is still SpaghettiOs save lives.
Yes, that's the takeaway lesson, I suppose.
Okay.
But
Cool.
let's get into I want to talk about the Ark of the Covenant. So, in
Okay.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was, of course, a supernatural face melting curse. But the Ark has been said, even if you follow biblical history, to have had a
Yes.
disease curse. And that's what I want to talk about and see if we can figure out what it is.
Okay. And so I don't know too much about the Old Testament. I think they discussed this briefly in the film, but the Ark of the Covenant is not. It's not Noah's Ark, right? It's supposed to be a box that I guess carries the gifts to mankind from God. Is that how it's supposed to go?
Yeah, I believe the Ten Commandments. What's in it is not pertinent initially to our discussion. It can stay the MacGuffin
Okay.
that it was.
Sure, sure. Just
But
the
let's go
thing.
back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's start with when the ark was hidden, it was sequestered along with a jar of manna so they could refill their MP
Okay.
and a flask of anointing
Sure.
oil
Okay.
and Aaron's staff, and also hidden with the ark was a chest that the Philistines sent as a gift to the God of Israel after they captured it and were stricken by several plagues. In one of the many battles between the Philistines and the people of Israel, the Israelites lost a battle. So then they came up with this
Okay.
plan: let's go get the Ark of the Covenant so that the Lord will be present among us, will deliver us from the hands of our enemies. So they were hoping for a little bit of indie face melting fighting the Philistines.
Well, I mean, they didn't know that's what it would do. I think at the time, they just thought we're bringing a piece of God with us onto the battlefield.
No, they were hoping for face melting. But this
Okay.
but this ended up turning out to be a terrible idea because the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, took it to a city called Ashdod, and put it into a temple of the Philistines' god Dagon.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
after after they had moved it, and so the Bible relates, the hand of the Lord came against the city, causing great panic. He struck the people, young and old, so that hemorrhoids broke out among them. And this
Oh
statue of
God.
their god and this statue of their god Dagon was toppled over in the temple and lost its head, and then they set it back up, and it toppled over again, and it lost some of the
Mhm.
arms and legs, so it was just a trunk. The Philistines, after having their idol knocked down and getting hemorrhoids, had had enough of this ark, decided to send it back to Israel, but they were warned by their priests, if you're going to send the ark to the God of Israel, don't send it away empty. You also have to pay a fee or a price. And they asked,
Okay.
what is this price that we should pay to him? And they were told 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice. The 5 for the number of lords of the Philistines. For the same plague
Okay.
struck all of you. So that's where our story
Oh,
begins.
that's the ancient history predating, what the Nazis want to do in the plot of the movie.
Right, right. So this all
Okay.
takes place long before Indy starts looking for the Ark. Indy would have had this kind of knowledge. Like the Ark was stolen by the Philistines. They had a plague of hemorrhoids. They sent it filled with golden
Yeah.
hemorrhoids, golden hemorrhoids and golden mice back to Israel. And,
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada. Professor Jones goes searching.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And this is the part where Indiana goes searching and finds them and everything else like this, and he really didn't have to.
So in early 2000, the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine started talking about this, and the story is in 1 Samuel. Um, and when they returned it, and it seems that the most characteristic features of this were rats and tumors, which gets me thinking dead rats
Okay.
killed
Yeah. Hmm.
by the same bacillus that kills human beings are often seen in the streets of plague towns. Enlarged lymph
Okay. Okay.
nodes in the groin are very obvious features. So, why would the Philistines send
Hmm.
statues of rodents and tumors to their neighbors as a we're sorry gift? Is this a friendly warning? We've had an epidemic. You should watch out for this. Or is it
Okay.
something, or is it the essence of the judgment on the Philistines? And they hoped, well, maybe the curse will end with us when we send it back.
As in kind of embody the plague. So the tumors that they're talking about there, tumors, we know we think about it as malignancy right now, cancer, but tumor is just an old timey word for swelling. And in this case, it's probably the buboes, which are characteristic of the bubonic plague, carried by fleas, which are carried on rodents. And so almost like embodying the plague in the gold with the rats and the buboes, the tumors on there, and then just, kind of almost like imbuing the spirit of that illness into the statues and then send them that way.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw a couple different religious texts out at you, and I am far from any kind of religious scholar. Please,
Sure.
if those of you listening at home are more familiar with these texts, send us a message, and we'll be happy to chat about it. But
Oh, yeah.
there is also another text called the Septuagint, a translation from Hebrew to Greek, done in Alexandria,
Okay.
as well as a
Yes.
different text known as the Vulgate, which is translated into Latin from this. And it says
It's
the Philistines were smitten with tumors, but the Septuagint and the Vulgate both expand on that and say, and rats appeared in their land, and death and destruction were throughout the city. He afflicted the people, young and old, with an outbreak of tumors being in the groin. So now we have something that sounds a lot more consistent with, as you said, bubonic plague rather than hemorrhoids.
right.
And that's where you're getting the rats, which are
Oh,
not
got it.
mentioned in the Bible.
Got you. Got okay. I understand. So originally, either as the story is, that it was hemorrhoids, or later on, the storytellers kind of came along and they were trying to understand how the gifts and stuff kind of came together, and either in the storytelling the hemorrhoids changed into buboes in the groin, or it was misinterpreted in the first place and someone was trying to tie all of the elements of the story together. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay.
So now let's look at the evidence that was kind of brought up by this Royal Journal of Medicine. And they feel it was due to a mistranslation because fossilized remains of the plague flea have been found in large numbers in the city of Amarna in Egypt. And Amarna was occupied for only a couple years before it turned into a ghost town. So you can actually trace the contact between human beings and plague fleas to about 1350 BC, which is well before the events described in that passage I just told you about. Uh,
Oh,
not
okay,
not
okay.
to mention, archaeological studies show that Rattus rattus, our common rodent, was
Hmm.
introduced around that same time via ships from India, and we've never seen evidence of bubonic plague in Egyptian mummies. So
Oh,
the
okay.
the evidence doesn't quite hold up with it. Now, we know from plague it causes a flu like illness. You have fevers, muscle cramps, and swelling of the lymph nodes, but nothing about hemorrhoids.
That association is not there.
So let's get into where the hemorrhoids came from. Let's go back to that Greek text, the Septuagint. According to the
Hmm.
number of lords of Philistines, here's what you have to send to them to appease the God of the Israelites: 5 buttocks of gold, for the plague was on you and your
Okay.
rulers. From the Greek version of the Hebrew, we move to the Latin, and the Latin
Okay.
translation, which is the Vulgate, gave us
Hmm.
the Cinque Años Oreos, 5 golden behinds,
Uh,
which
okay.
which was then
All right.
translated by the King James Bible as 5 golden emerods or hemorrhoids.
Oh, I see. So this was probably like many mistranslations around the way until you got to the most current translation. Got it. Got it.
Right. So that's how
Okay.
we got from a maybe bubonic plague to hemorrhoids. So they have to send 5 golden behinds. But I'm going to give you another possible theory. And this is what made me want to talk about this story.
Okay.
Here is a disease that plagues the Philistines that commonly kills rodents, might
Okay.
pass rarely into humans, causes fever, pneumonia, swelling of the lymph nodes in the neck and groin, and all of this centers around a box as a vehicle for the disease, the Ark of the Covenant. And
Oh.
shortly after the box is delivered, rodents appear and are depicted in the settlement paid in gold. So the word for rodents doesn't really distinguish between mice and rats. So yeah, rats would have
Okay.
carried Yersinia pestis,
Hmm.
but
Well,
mice.
I mean, the fleas. Yeah, the fleas on the rats, and then eventually the rats, etc. Yeah.
But if you had mice nesting in
Okay.
a gold-plated wooden box,
Okay.
and those mice, upon being delivered to, say, a temple, would have explored their new habitat, offering an explanation for where a disease is being introduced. And also, if they get out and they run around and they knock over a local statue several times and then come back to the box at night and then leave it
Yeah.
again, they would have tipped over the statuette after repeated falls. So if we link mice to the ark, and then we can start singling out this disease. Do you have any idea what I'm thinking, Santosh?
Still going with plague. There are several mimics of plague out there that are again largely zoonotic. Um, it's not going to be rickettsia. It's not going to be typhus or Rocky Mountain spotted fever or scrub typhus, which can also look like that. I can see them in my mind too, like having large lymph nodes and fevers. Brucella can do it, although it's a little bit more thing. Were there any rabbits?
You're on the right track. This is a disease carried by mice and rabbits, and I am, of
Oh,
course, talking about tularemia.
okay, gotcha. If you had thrown one more in there and you had said like conjunctivitis, then I think I might have gotten it there. But okay, so yeah. So rather than being plague, which still can transmit, via fleas and mice and stuff like that, but a mimic that would still occur in large amounts when you had overcrowding in a city. There are these diseases of overcrowding. I mentioned a couple of them: scrub typhus and plague as well. But So this is another one, huh? This as tularemia, running around and acting a lot like plague.
So, what does tularemia look like? So, you mentioned rabbits, but
Wabbits, uh-huh.
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Wascally wabbits.
in the modern day, how do
Sure.
we get tularemia? So, let's say you and I took the Ark on just a fun little journey on a road trip,
Uh-huh.
and it was filled with mice carrying tularemia. Tell me how it's transmitted. What are some of the symptoms? Without us turning
Yeah.
this into a traditional 80 plagues, let's get the Cliff's Notes version of the
Yeah.
disease.
Absolutely. So it's a disease that is found, all it's found in the United States, but it does happen across the world. Um, the board question that we usually get when we're sitting there reading our national boards for medicine is a person skinning a rabbit. So they're hunter and they're skinning a rabbit because then you can aerosolize it. But most commonly, you get an insect bite, and then soon after, if you get bitten, you get these swollen and painful lymph nodes. So it can be under your arm where your axillary nodes are, your neck, if it's the cervical lymph nodes, or under your throat, the submandibular ones, or if you're bitten and you're kind of going through tall grass and you're being bitten by these ticks and deer flies and stuff. It can go into the groin, and then a lot of the time, especially if it's traveled close to your neck, you also have inflammation of the whites of your eyes, conjunctivitis, sometimes sore throat, and then diarrhea or pneumonia, depending on what your body decides to do. But certainly, along with that, you can get fever, chills, and headache. Those systemic symptoms, though, tend to happen more quickly if, for instance, you are skinning the rabbit and you inhale the bacteria instead. And then, weirdly enough, Josh, it can look a lot like the flu. You're just sick, fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, and dry cough. And a lot of these folks are treated like they have the flu. And unless you were to ask them, have you been camping? Have you been hunting? Did you go someplace where you were exposed to ticks and fleas and rodents? You may not make this diagnosis because it's very dependent on the history.
Now, remember, we said 1350 BC was when we had plague reservoirs, and it was a little too early. But
Right.
tularemia was known in the Middle East and Egypt around that time, and we have accounts from a couple of papyri that I haven't mentioned all too often. You know me, I'm normally all about the Ebers papyrus, it's one of my favorite. But this comes from
Yeah.
the
Oh, yeah.
Hurst papyrus and the London medical papyrus, which talk of an epidemic that could have been tularemia around 1715 BC, which does put us in the right era. The disease was believed to have originated in the Near East, coming to Egypt via contaminated ships. And the same author argues that Canaan was a reservoir for tularemia, and the outbreak among the Philistines was a good indication of that. All of this, of course, presupposes
Oh.
that the Philistines assumed there was a link between the rodents and the disease that afflicted them. And we have that because we have in the description of that book of Samuel, they sent 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden rats as an I'm sorry gift, which to me says they're like, listen, we know that there's something about these mice or rodents linking the disease.
Okay, wonderful. This is really, really cool. I love this. So we have some forensic, medical anthropology right here, where we're actually going through and making a really good, kind of differential diagnosis, and a diagnosis based on the history that we can piece together, and probably, just like you're saying, Josh, some forensic evidence about who lived where and when, and then the most likely culprits. The final piece would really be if we could actually find, because nowadays we can do forensic pathology and we can find DNA and things like that. If we could find real evidence of the infection like that in mummified lymph nodes and things like that in grave sites. But I don't know if we have anything like that, huh?
We don't, although there is a fantastic paper that I will link in the show notes called How Disease Affected the End of the Bronze Age. And that one isn't strictly
Mm,
biblical, but it talks about how a lot of different civilizations collapsed in this time frame of 50 years. You saw mass migrations and abandonment of cities, and the diseases most likely to cause this collapse at the end of the paper are smallpox, plague, and tularemia. So we are
okay.
not giving
Yes.
tularemia enough credit as a killer in the ancient world. And to circle back around, now we have at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, we have now brought the Ark of the Covenant, face melting ghosts aside, into a warehouse.
I can't remember, but this is when it's being put in that giant friggin' warehouse.
So at the end of Raiders, they move the box into this giant warehouse full of all the other boxes,
Yeah,
and it's kept under guard. And if there are still the same tularemic rats or rodents in there, which is a long time for them to
yeah,
live,
yeah, yeah. Well,
now we are
yeah.
potentially infecting all the other mysterious supernatural artifacts with tularemia. And this
Sure.
is kind of still an ongoing philosophical and religious debate. So scholars are still going back and forth arguing, is it plague, is it tularemia, or is it something else?
Okay, and it's kind of cool because we can go through and you know, we have these discussions all the time. What killed Beethoven and what made him deaf? Or what possibly killed Mozart, which is much more difficult because the record of his life is much more. Did Abraham Lincoln have Marfan's disorder because of his height and everything else like that? I actually love this type of forensic investigation. Although in this case, the answer could actually tell us a lot about the evolution of the history of infections during that time. So I like this. I hope we're able to get a punchline to this, like actually figure this out and pin down this mystery somewhere in our future.
I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but just the idea that the arc causing plagues, face melting versus rodent groin infecting, was fascinating enough to warrant at least a short little layover before we get back into our more regular programming. So, hopefully, those of you listening at home got as excited about this as I did, either because you are into Indiana Jones, biblical studies, disease, or the weird Venn diagram where our show sits that all three of those intersect.
I love where our show sits. It's- the middle of that Venn diagram is one of my absolute faves. It's fantastic.
Biblical scholars,
But no,
Indiana Jones
yeah.
enthusiasts, disease investigators. Where do they all overlap? Travel medicine.
Travel medicine. Oh yeah. I do hope that some of you out there, if you find this educational and fun, that's absolutely wonderful and all that kind of a thing. I have a little bit of a fantasy though in my mind, Josh, that there's a young kind of person, maybe high school or early college, and they maybe hear our podcast for the first time because they recommend it because they happen to be Indiana Jones loving, history loving medical enthusiasts, and they say, "Oh, yeah." Then our episode comes out and everything like that. There's like, "Oh my God, that's a job!" And we actually, introduce someone to forensic pathology, or I can't remember. Was it forensic anthropology, Josh? The study of using history and anthropology in order to discover our plagues and such, or and
Yes.
learn more about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I would, that would make me so happy if we inspired one of those folks.
So
Like, yeah,
that's it.
I didn't know I could do that for a living. You're damn right.
So
Yeah.
that's it for this week. As always, we love to hear your comments, questions, and feedback. If you'd like to support us spiritually, emotionally, or financially, links to do that are in the show notes, along with links for further reading. We're also on TikTok, where you can sign up for our mailing list to find out about upcoming live appearances, where we will talk over the history of all things medicine, from pop culture
Ooh.
to the ancient world. And our theme music is composed by Rachel Leisure. The show is produced by me with a lot of help from Dr. Santhosh and friends. And until next time, as always, keep a song in your heart, soap on your hands, a shot in your arm, a spin on your globe. And when you've done all of those things, pick a country to travel to, check the disease warnings, and happy travels.
Bye, everybody.